How was the video last week? Like it? Any questions about it, or? Pretty straightforward, I guess. Yeah, you had a question before class, and I figured we could tell everybody else in the class. And she brought up a good point. She says, like, for example, Matthew 20 says that Jesus predicts his own death and resurrection. And he says, you know, I'm going to go to Jerusalem, and the Pharisees are going to persecute me, crucify me, I'll be dead, and on the third day I'll rise again.
This is Jonah as.
But that's a different. Yeah, he does it like 3 different times. He does it maybe more than 3 times. I know there's at least 3. But so the question is, what would a skeptic say to that if you said that this is an example? Because it's a good example. If someone predicts something is going to happen in the future, and then that happens in the future, that's good evidence that they know what they're talking about, right? But what's the Achilles heel to this when we're talking to a skeptic?
To his prediction?
You're right. To Jesus' prediction of his death.
And that it happened exactly as he said.
Right.
And in one, it said, they were questioning him, how do we know you're the Messiah, or give us proof.
Mm-hmm.
And then he says, well, this is my proof. I'll be in the ground 3 days and 3 nights,
Right.
just as Jonah was. Then he said that twice. So.
No, prophecy is always really good to use. The only problem that you're going to run into, and what a skeptic will bring up, is the Gospels were written after the fact. So they can make the claim that Jesus never really said that. Matthew, when he wrote his Gospel, put those words into Jesus' mouth to prove his point. Because Matthew was written after the resurrection. That's the only trouble that you'll end up running into as you bring that up with a skeptic, because that's exactly the first thing they're going to say. Well, the Gospels, they'll either deny the Gospels are true, or they'll say that was after the fact. A better example of prophecy that you can verify was written before the events would be something like the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel predicts Jesus Christ coming, and there's one guy that wrote a book, and you can read through it. The Coming Prince, I think is what it's called. He actually calculates the number of days, and it's the day that Jesus Christ goes into Jerusalem, to the day. So that's kind of like a pretty impressive thing if you calculate it all out, the prophecy.
But then the skeptic tries to say Daniel's works were written after the fact.
Right, but the Dead Sea Scrolls, we have copies that predate the coming of Jesus. So we have copies of the book of Daniel prior to Jesus coming.
Okay, good.
Oh, that's a good one.
So this is what, and this is why it's kind of important, because when you talk to a skeptic, you have to understand how they're thinking in their mind. You have to kind of like think the way they think, right? And so they're trying to say, well, you know, all this stuff was written after the fact, and so it could be possibly pointing back to that. So if we can have any evidence that something happened before, then we have it. Now, so people would always say the Old Testament said this stuff, and so skeptics would say prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they would say, oh, well, that could have been a late addition after, you know, Christianity was in place, and the Christians threw that stuff in there, or, you know, they just made up the whole entire book afterwards. Problem is, now that we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we date all of them, or most of them, are dated prior to Jesus, like 200 BC, so 200 years before Jesus, to about the time of Jesus, we have all these Dead Sea Scrolls. And so now we have evidence prior to Jesus being on the scene, and we have hard evidence, right? You know, this is like the best type of evidence that we could possibly have. So although we all believe that Jesus said that prior to his death, the skeptics aren't going to accept that.
Even though in the Old Testament it talks about he will be the sacrifice, doesn't say he or
Right.
Jesus, but there will be a sacrificial lamb.
Right.
And then that all ties together.
Right. So and the harder one with that is you have a whole bunch of Jews that read the same thing and they don't come to the same conclusion, right? So, and they...
Sacrificial lamb is who then?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's the question you have to start asking them, and then they retreat into other areas. Like, well, a lot of this is metaphorical, or yeah, it says that, but it hasn't happened yet, and Jesus really wasn't it, and so even though they read the Old Testament, they still come to a different conclusion. So we just have to be sensitive to these things, so that when we're talking with them, we understand where they're going to go with it. Now, I'm not saying don't use it, but I'm just saying there is going to be a liability depending on who you talk to, because they're going to say, well, it was written after the fact. So, of course, I'm going to add all those things into the Gospels. And funny thing, if you read the book like Luke, I think Luke did it probably more than anybody else. He said, Jesus said these things and we didn't understand it at the time. Right? Which is an interesting little statement to put into a story. You're telling a story and all of a sudden you say, well, at the time we didn't understand it, but now we do. Because you can definitely tell then he's saying, hey, this is after the fact. I'm talking about something that happened before that we didn't understand, but now with hindsight we now understand what it is. So it's really interesting because it gives the impression of an authenticity. In other words, Luke is really writing this work that he's saying it because he's saying, hey, we heard these things, but we didn't understand those things.
Maybe add them all together.
Right.
What verse was that, or what chapter in Luke?
Oh, it's like throughout the book. There's a number of examples of it. A really useful thing to do is also get like a harmony of the Gospels and kind of read through them all together. I found that that's really helpful too. So a lot of scholars struggle with like timing as to when did this event happen compared to like Matthew and Luke and Mark may disagree on a certain event as to when it happened, and so they're trying to figure it out. Luke, interestingly enough, in his Gospel says he's trying to put together an orderly account. Well, what does he mean by orderly? Like, is he saying that he recognizes that Matthew and Mark are not in order? That's an interesting point that he brings that up. Anyways, there's a lot of these little phrases throughout the Gospels that you have to kind of like, have your antennas up for when you're reading them, because they're telling us something more than, we have a tendency to skip over it. One, it's not red letters, so Jesus didn't say it, so and it's not really about the story that we're reading, about the parable. But those little statements give us lots of clues if we pay attention to them. And there's a whole bunch more that you can learn about the Gospel by looking for that kind of stuff. Again, it's worth taking a look at those things. All of those things kind of give the Gospels 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 points in their favor of being authentic. Because what you end up having is, if somebody was writing this after the fact, why would they think to put these little things in there? It doesn't make any sense. If I'm making up a story, everybody makes up stories all the time. They don't put in all these little things all these sidebar things, because it's really just a distraction to your point, if you think about it. Because even when we read it, we say that's a distraction. I don't really care about that. I want to read about the parable and what Jesus meant by it. But that distraction kind of gives a seal of authenticity to it and gives us more information that we can go into. Interestingly enough, too, throughout the Gospels, there's name places, people name places. So they name a number of different things that if you were writing the Gospel 100 years later, you wouldn't know. So that's a lot of interesting things, because some of the stuff we didn't know until later on when we did archaeology and we found out, oh yeah, it was called this at this point in time. Yeah. So there's a lot of really good information there. So the Gospels, aside from this, can stand historically. Now, and that's why a lot of people, when they look at that, they will say, like Bart Ehrman, he says, well, yeah, the Gospels are generally reliable, but all the stuff about miracles isn't reliable. So even though you have that kind of stuff, and things like this where Jesus predicts something, well, that's probably not true. That was put in after the fact. That's what Bart Ehrman would say even though he does think a lot of not a lot, but the skeleton of the Gospels is true, that Jesus did exist, that he was here at this point in time, that he was crucified and died, and that's about as far as he goes. But he thinks that those things are authentic. So it's interesting, though. You have a scholar who's a skeptic who comes to at least that far of a conclusion. And people that usually aren't a scholar will just say, oh, Jesus was just completely a myth. They really don't know what they're talking about. Anyway, so we're talking about the 4+1 facts. So we talked about Jesus died by crucifixion, right? We talked about a number of those things, and that Jesus' disciples believe that he rose again and appear to them. We talked about that extensively. Then we talked about the biblical witness and the extra-biblical witnesses. In other words, things outside the Bible that confirm what the Bible is saying. Written by people that were Christians and written by people that were not Christians. And we focus mostly on the ones that are skeptics, or the ones that were not Christians when we talked about, like the Roman historians and stuff. Because the early church fathers did talk about it extensively, and we could go through all of them. And we did talk about some of them, but there's even more. There's actually a number of lost documents that other church fathers referenced. This early church father wrote this, but we don't have the original work, right? So there's a bunch of that kind of stuff going on as well. So now we're going to talk about Paul and James. Paul and James were not on the bandwagon with the disciples. In other words, they didn't think that Jesus was the Messiah who was coming. In fact, Paul was persecuting the church, right? So if we say, and why is this important? Why are we taking out Paul and James specifically and setting them aside different than the apostles? Well, the apostles apparently heard this thing that Jesus said he was going to die and rise again from the dead, right? So they heard this thing, and when Jesus dies, and then they see him again, of course they believe it. Now, of course, the skeptic may say, well, they didn't really see him. Well, what happened then? Well, this is what they'll say. They had an hallucination. Because they loved him so much, and they wanted what he said to be true, that they just had a hallucination. And so what will they cite for evidence? They'll cite for evidence, like spouses that have been married for 40 years or something like that, who, after one spouse dies, they will oftentimes report that, oh, I heard my husband or my wife the other day. I heard them talking in the other room, and I went out there and they weren't there, So they have a hallucination. The interesting thing about those hallucinations that we should probably look at, and one of them is that those types of hallucinations, people know that they are hallucinations. So they hear it and they know that it's a hallucination. Most people realize that they're having a hallucination. In other words, that it's not real. That's an interesting fact, because these people did not indicate that. All right, so yes, they love this person very much. They think they're hearing voices on them. Typically, when someone has an hallucination, it's only one sense. What do I mean by sense? Your five senses, your touch, feel, sight, hearing, smelling. Usually when people have a hallucination about a loved one that they are missing or something like that, they will say, I heard them. They didn't see anything, they didn't smell anything, they didn't touch anything, right? Or, I thought I saw him in the grocery store. Well, they saw him, but they didn't hear him, they didn't smell him, they didn't feel him. It's always just one sensation, not a combination of sensations. Different in Jesus' story is it's all of the different combinations. It is touch, feel, he told Thomas, touch me. They heard him, they saw him. Right? So this is a different type of thing altogether. So if you look at hallucinations scientifically or psychologically to see what people are having for hallucinations, this is nothing like it. And it's definitely not like taking any drugs or anything like this, because it seems like it's a normal event, right? If you ever read, I think there's a thing called the Gospel of Peter or something like that. It was written way later by the Gnostics. And it says that Jesus came out of the grave, and then the cross was alive, and the cross crawled out of the grave, and all this stuff. If that's not metaphor, then that's like somebody on drugs, right? They're tripping really hard or something, right? Because they're explaining this weird, bizarre stuff. This is nothing like the account of Jesus. There's nothing bizarre about it. I mean, it's like he's in the room, and he's talking to him, talking like he was talking before, not saying anything new or different or weird. You know what I mean? So there's this consistency there. So when you look at the hallucination, if it was a hallucination, it would be really kind of weird. The other thing about hallucinations is, let's say we were all going to have a hallucination in this room today. We would all have something different as a hallucination. We would not all see the exact same thing. Now for the atheists, this is the really tough one for them, because especially if they're materialistic. Because if our thoughts are nothing more than chemical reactions inside of my skull, how did the misfiring calculations in my skull also get into your skull at the same time?
You were leaking.
Yeah, apparently, right? They have a really hard time explaining that. So they can't say that there's these mass hallucinations, because that doesn't work. Plus, if we were all sitting in this room and Bob says he had a hallucination and it was of somebody standing in here, the rest of us will look at him and say, yeah, we don't see him. Right? I mean, so it's, yeah, you know, we may say, oh yeah, Bob, that, yeah, you know, and as soon as he leaves the room, be like, you know, that guy. So even if one person had it, the rest of them going along with it, they might go along with it when he's in the room, but as soon as he's out of the room, they're like, did you see that? You know what I mean? So again, is this really reasonable for us to say, oh, it was a hallucination and we're all seeing the same thing, or one of us is seeing the same thing, we're all just going along with it? It doesn't make any sense. Yes?
Other than Elvis Presley, is there any documented mass hallucination?
Well, that's not even a mass hallucination. No. Yeah, but yeah. No, there is no documentation. There's no clinical.
Recorded or
Nope.
anything like that?
No.
So it's just a miracle.
It must have been a quantum occurrence or something. Anyways, actually, Habermas, one of the guys that wrote this book, the other guy, not Lacona, but Habermas, he's actually gone through all the scientific journals looking for anything on hallucinations and looking specifically for anything about mass hallucinations or group hallucinations. And again, what he finds is we may all have a hallucination at the same time, but we all saw something different. It was all weird. At the end, we all knew it was a hallucination because it wasn't in accordance with reality. So, I mean, even when you Native Americans go on like their spirit journeys or whatever, and they smoke peyote or whatever it is, and then they go off on this weird quest or whatever it is. You notice that it's always, and it's funny because everybody has their own. So if you were to say that that's a hallucination, okay, fine, let's say that. The Native Americans recognize that when everybody does this, they all have their own individual experience, as if for them the spirits are talking directly to them in only words that they can understand, and nobody else gets that same thing, right? So if that is a hallucination, then guess what? The Native Americans recognize that only one person has one hallucination, and that's all that they get, right? But science is showing us the same thing. There's no scientific.
Does Mark Ehrman have any response for that at all? I'm sure somebody has presented that to him somewhere along the line.
I think there has, but he goes back on the fact that they just loved him so much that they really wanted him, and so they just really wanted to believe because they loved him so much.
In his singular opinion.
Right. So yeah, he doesn't really have a whole lot there, and I think in one debate that I heard him in, he kind of fell back on the thing that I'm a biblical scholar, I'm not a psychologist, he kind of fell back on that. And other people have said that it's possible, but he didn't refer to who and all that kind of stuff. It's interesting because there's a couple gotchas for these excuses that they come up with. But then he says, well, then it could be this other excuse. I mean, they kind of like play this chess game. Okay, so just while we're clear, hallucination, we'll just take that one off the table. That's what I would tell them. We'll just take that off the table. And that's gone because we know that that's not possible. Okay, so let's go look at these other excuses that you have. And we'll look at those and see what they come up with.
If you're going to play cards and come up with, well, that one didn't work, here's another one, obviously you don't have a clue what went on because you're just guessing. Right.
Well, here's the thing. This is what they do, and this is why I picked this very advisedly when I said, well, take this off the table. In fact, I would even use visual aids when I talk to them. Okay, what are the possibilities? Possibility A, possibility B. Because what they will do is they'll say, oh, possibility A is not true. Okay, possibility B. Okay, possibility C, he's an alien. All right. Then we talk about that, and he's like, okay, well, that's not true. Well, it could still be the hallucination. No, we just deleted that, right? You just keep on going in a circle.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying when you talk to them, it's a good thing if you use little visual aids or something and say, okay, hallucinations. All right, now let's deal with the next two, right? Because otherwise, they will just play this shell game with you, and you'll end up going in circles forever. This is exactly what happens.
Yeah.
Like he said, if you keep giving the cards, you'll get the hand you want after a while.
Exactly. Exactly. So part of what they're talking about is sometimes people will believe something that's false. So, and they may even believe it sincerely, right? And so is there anything that would lead us to believe that the disciples' belief was something real? Is there any types of things like that? So we're talking about all these weird reasons that we can come up with. Now we're going to throw in some other things. So let's say there's some questions as to whether the apostles did it. Fine. You have some questions, although we don't think hallucination's it. But you have some questions. So let's look at some other examples of people that were not friendly to Jesus, who did not have that deep desire and love for him to, give him false impressions. So we'll talk about Paul. Now, being a skeptic and persecuting the church, thinking the church was wrong, had, along the road to Damascus, an experience that changed him to the point that he's willing to die for it. Well, how many times do we have that kind of experience that it changes us so dramatically that we do a 180-degree change, but beyond 180-degree change? Because it's not about we just turned around. It's like Paul's heading in this direction, does a 180-degree change, and it starts running in the exact opposite direction. That's what happened. It's not just changing his mind. He just started pursuing it very vigorously.
It would be even not so much saying, well, okay, I believe in that now. Now I am going to be an advocate for.
No, it's
And
wrong.
be willing to be persecuted and.
I mean, that's so much more than just saying, okay, I think that's true.
And here's the thing. You could say, well, he didn't know that he was going to get killed. He oversaw the death of Stephen, right? So he knew exactly what the people that he was working with were all of his friends, all of his colleagues, all the people that he was with and persecuting with him, and he knows their mob mentality. He knows that they want to kill those people. And what does he do? He says, okay, bye guys, I'm going to go on the other team, the team that you're killing. And I'm on that team now.
And I'm going to be a primary advocate for, not just join the team.
Right.
I'm going to be one of the,
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is kind of a big thing. So we can look through the book of Acts for this information. Stephen was martyred in Acts 7. They were putting Christians in prisons in Acts 8 and 9. Paul's persecution was widely known, right? So he uses this when he's writing his letter to the Galatians and said, hey, you knew that I was a persecutor of the church in Galatian, countries away, right? But not a day's walk away, right? It's like a distance away. They knew about his reputation. And he talks about this throughout this. He did have this reputation because a lot of times he'll say, I came to you, and where does he say this? Something about, when I came to you, you had a little bit of trepidation because I was a persecutor of the church. You're like, is he really on our team, or is he just trying to infiltrate us so he can kill us all, right? So a lot of people were being trepidatious of it. So, what?
How intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it.
Right. So if you look at that, when he says intensely, the word he's saying there is above and beyond excessively. So he's using a word that says, I was big time into this, right? Excessively into it. And to destroy it, he's talking about making havoc, destroying, ravaging it, just trying to tear it all apart type of thing, right? That's the word that he's using here. Sometimes in the English we don't get the nuances of it. Those two words are like the extreme, right? Extremely destroying something, extremely going after something.
Wouldn't Paul be a good candidate to believe he himself was hallucinating, or somebody to accuse him of that?
Well, if you were so dead set against the church, wouldn't that be the first thing you thought when you heard some voice coming at you? Why are you persecuting me? Oh, wait, this is a hallucination. Something's going on here or something.
I'm thinking of my atheist friend reasoning like that.
Well, it's interesting that it's like Paul needed like a really big slap in the face to wake him up, right? That's kind of what he needed. Yeah, exactly. He needed something major to change his heart, and God gave him something major to change his heart. This is an interesting thing too. So no matter how hard somebody's heart is, if there's a chance, God will do whatever it takes. Right? to get them in line. And it's interesting because sometimes I know people that they just haven't come to the Lord or whatever, and sometimes my prayer is do whatever it takes. I mean, if it has to take illness, sickness, loss, or whatever it is, I'd rather see them in heaven than whatever earthly things they have here. So God, do whatever it takes to do it. That's a scary prayer to give because you don't know where that's going to go. They may have to go all the way down to rock bottom before they're willing to accept God's help. So, but it's interesting. Obviously, Paul didn't need to go all that way. Just the blindness and the appearance of Jesus and all that kind of stuff. but he had to. It was kind of something major because God doesn't do this every day, right? So it was a big thing. So now it changed his mind from being. Now, would a hallucination change people's minds so drastically? Now, mind you, other people have had an hallucination, apparently. If we're going to go with the hallucination story, they've had their hallucination, and even though it's a miracle that they all had the exact same one, let's just grant that, right? And now we're going to have the bad guys are going to also have, the ones opposed to it are going to have hallucinations too, and all of a sudden they're going to want to join these people, even though they know for a fact that they will probably get killed for it. Now we're just stretching things with incredulity here, right? We have to say, oh, mass people had hallucinations. They all had the same one. Okay, well, that's a stretch. That's a miracle. And then we have to believe in this other miracle that you take somebody that is so dead set against it, who knows what's going to happen to it, to switch over. Change his mind completely. So it doesn't make any sense. Why would somebody, if you were persecuting them, if you had a hallucination, because hallucinations are usually something that's in your mind that is being brought forward. If it was a hallucination, why wasn't his hallucination, Paul, they're persecuting me and they have the wrong message, and the Christians have the wrong message. You now have the right message. Right, and he'd be off on his own doing his own thing. Right? So there's all these other things that could happen. He could still persecute the Christians. So some people will say, well, maybe this is guilt, because he feels guilty because of Stephen's death. So, okay, the Christians had this hallucination because they loved him so much, and Paul's now having one because he feels guilty for what he did. Okay, so now we're really stretching it thin, right? We still have James to deal with. We're going to stretch it even thinner there. So what would charge it? Paul's conversion is important because it went from him being the enemy of the church to being one of its largest supporters, like you said. And what would it take for someone to have such a drastic change? Like being slapped in the face with the truth? Like seeing someone you know to be dead to be alive? Something that, and not in a hallucination way, because again, a lot of people know that it's a hallucination, and afterwards they question, well, was that real? Was that, I don't even know if I really heard what I thought I heard, right? You see that a lot. You ever watch those ghost story shows? I watch them all the time. Anyways, people will always go in there, I heard a voice over here, but I wasn't really 100% sure. See, they're always not 100% sure about what they may or may not have heard, right? It never really, it may scare them, but that's about it.
I remember when my mother was about the last year she was alive, and her mother did the same thing about the last year she was alive. She would see hallucinations all the time. And she'd say, yeah, that little guy's sitting up there, and he's watching me. But I know he isn't real. I know it's a hallucination, but I can see him up there. I mean, she knew what was not real. Exactly what you're saying, but amazingly.
Right.
I was always amazed that she could differentiate what was a hallucination and what wasn't.
You know, it's interesting. My grandfather had the exact same thing when he was in the hospital, just before he died. He said that he could see people going up into the vents. They would go up and they would just disappear. So it's interesting. But how do they know that that's not real? Because they know that what reality is, right? We have our day-to-day experiences. They see something like that and they're like, that's not real. So, again, is that enough to change Paul's mind?
That's a good question. To be able to do what Paul did to persecute these people without a lot of elaboration on what that means must have entailed killing if necessary, rounding them up like animals and imprisoning them, and not having any kind of sympathy or love or care about them.
Conscience.
Not trying to bring them back into the fold of Judaism.
Right.
To me indicates that that's not a mental or a mind issue, it's a heart issue. And you're focusing quite a bit here on his mind.
Right.
As if though all this is logical, something that you think about, without considering what kind of person he was, what his
Right.
heart was made of, and how that had to be the conversion. It wasn't
Oh,
his
yeah.
mind, it wasn't just that he went blind, but it had to be something more than that. And I would refer to it as he had to have a heart conversion.
Oh, yeah.
He had to become an entirely different person, completely.
Right.
So it's the miracle of Paul is not just that he went blind and suddenly became a believer. It's a lot more than that.
Yeah, I agree. With everyone's conversion, there has to be a change in the heart, right? And I don't mean to downplay that. I'm really just meaning to get rid of the idea that it's possibly a hallucination, because hallucination is all a mind thing, not a heart thing, right? And so we know that it's probably just by the way people's minds work, and Bob had a good example there. This just doesn't happen. People don't see hallucinations, believe them, and then change their heart because of a hallucination. So you're bringing in a good point to the whole conversation. And we could take a look at like Paul's conversion in Acts 9. He believed that he had witnessed the risen Christ, right? So he was so strong, like the original disciples, so it's like that, was willing to suffer continuously for the sake of the gospel, even to the point of martyrdom. At any point in time, he could say, oh, I'm done with this. It was all hallucination. I don't really believe that this happened. You know, I fell off my horse and got sand in my eye, and that's what really happened, or whatever, right? He could have done all that at some point in time in his career. After he got killed once, right? He got stoned, and then, or maybe he was almost dead, who knows. But he got back up and then continued on preaching the message that just got him stoned. Literally, he should have been dead. And he got back up and said, okay, let's keep on doing this. All right, so this is, we call that dedication, right? So if being dedicated for a lie that you know is a lie is completely different than being dedicated to a lie when you think it's the truth, right? Completely different thing. So when a terrorist flies an airplane into the towers, they believe it's true. Otherwise, they probably wouldn't have done it, right? They're not going to do it for a lie. They're doing it for a reason that they believe to be true. So in Paul's instance, we have him, he obviously believes it's true, but it goes beyond that, doesn't it? Now, Paul makes the mention that he's not getting, Peter didn't come and talk to him and then he become a Christian about Peter telling him that Jesus had been risen from the dead. Because Paul had already heard all that. Did Paul believe it? No. So it wasn't about Paul being told about the gospel. You see the big difference there? He wasn't told by Peter, Paul, James. He already heard that story. He didn't believe it. It wasn't until Jesus appeared to him that he believed it. So this is a big thing. So Jesus directly appeared to Paul. So he has firsthand evidence that Jesus Christ rose from the dead, as opposed to someone told him. Yes, someone did tell him, but he didn't believe it, and he was persecuting him because they were saying that. So we would consider Paul, in this example, a primary witness, an eyewitness to the resurrection of Jesus. So he is also an eyewitness. He's not just telling the story that the disciples told. He's actually one of the people that experienced it. So there's a difference there. So remember we were talking about what kind of evidence do we want to look at and which one's better? Primary evidence versus secondary evidence. So eyewitnesses are better than someone who heard a eyewitness say something. Now secondary evidence can still be useful, but it's not as reliable as primary evidence. So when we have Paul, we have a primary source. So obviously primary better than secondary. Now most of us, we're all based on secondary sources, right? So, in the case of like the Gospel of Matthew, we're the third level source, right? Because Peter experienced it, Mark wrote it down for him, now we're hearing it. So now we're removed from it a couple of steps. So some of these types of things we don't have the same benefit that they had, because they had eyewitnesses that they could go and ask. And Paul even recommended, if you don't believe me, go ask the other people that seen them. They're still alive, right? So if Paul's going to make something up, and then he's going to start saying, hey, go ask all the other people that saw it too. That doesn't make any sense. That's kind of like here, go falsify what I just told you. And here's how. You can go ask these people. They were still all around. So we know that John was still around. John wasn't dead yet. Even by the time he got martyred, I think a lot of the apostles were still around. So anyways, we want to make sure that we're saying, hey, this is primary evidence that we're based upon, and then Luke wrote down Paul's story in Luke and Acts, right? So, or primarily Acts, right? And then we have copies of Paul's own writings. So we have multiple different sources. We have Luke's interpretation of what happened in the events, and then we have Paul himself in his own words writing down what happened. So what does that tell us? We have Paul himself. We have Luke telling us about Paul, and then we also know that it's well known back then because he tells the Galatians, hey, this is something that's well known to everybody else. So we have quite a few different things. Now, what about Paul dying for what he believes? Now, because a lot of people want to say, Paul didn't die for what he believed in, right? Yeah, he believed all that stuff, but he must have just, somebody the other day was telling me Paul didn't get martyred in Rome. He later left and went to Spain. Then he came back and died there or something. I don't know what the story was. I don't know. It's one of those weird TV shows, and I was watching. I'm trying to figure out, like, where do you get all this information? Where do you get this idea that he went to Spain and then came back and whatever?
That's a sports journey that they think happened.
Right.
But there's no documentation of it. They think it happened and he went back to Rome.
Right. And some people say that he wasn't really martyred for it, right? That he just died an old man in Rome or something like that. But we have a number of different sources, right? So we have Luke, we have Clement of Rome, Polycarp, Tertullian, Eusebius, and Eusebius quoting two other people who we don't have their works anymore, saying that Paul was killed for what he believed. So we know he had a conversion, and we know that he died for what he believed, right? So we can show, yes.
No. Maybe Luke, I'm kind of iffy, but wasn't he in fact killed for it because he accused the emperor of living out of I guess we call it wedlock or something like that? And then the emperor, mistress or whatever she was, didn't like him talking about it. That's why he asked him to bring him to it.
No, that was John the Baptist. That's John the Baptist. That was John the Baptist. We don't really know a whole lot about Paul's. There's a lot of tradition, but we don't have any primary source evidence. It's secondary source evidence from hundreds of years later. So Sean McDowell is writing a book about all the apostles and all the evidence for and against what may or may not have happened to all of them.
Is that Sean or Josh?
Sean.
Sean?
Yeah, his son. I think it's going to be out like next year or something like that. It's a book. I'm waiting to see it. I'm excited for it because there's a lot of stuff about traditions, about Thomas going to India or whatever. But okay, what's that based on? Where's the documentation for it? So he did research on all of this to in a scholarly fashion, not in the fashion that these hacks that you always see on the Discovery Channel say, oh, Thomas definitely went here and we know this happened. Based on what, right? We don't know that that's happened. So it'll be a really interesting book to check out. So, and like Paul's, you notice the end of the book of Luke just like ends abruptly. So the question is, was there an ending to the book of Luke that got lost, like a final page that somehow got lost? Or is the ending of Luke that way because Luke was with him in Rome and they both got executed. Don't know. But if you read the book of Luke, it's just like all of a sudden it's just done. It's like, okay, there's no, in conclusion, they lived happily ever after. They all died for their faith. None of that. Luke doesn't do any of that kind of stuff. It just like got cut off. As if either we lost the page or as if he could not continue writing. So interesting stuff to look at, but that's just a side note. But then we have all these other folks explaining that they were martyred. And I'm not sure if they include Mark or Luke being one of the ones martyred or not. Don't know. So Jesus, the brother of James. Now there's a lot of information about him. One, we get the impression that he's very Jewish in his approach, very much like a Pharisee almost. Because even after he joins the church, he still wants to enforce the old Levitical laws, and he's one of the main proponents to saying, hey, they need to be circumcised, right? And we hear about this story about him saying, him and Peter really being big on this, well, Gentiles need to be circumcised as well. And then Paul's the one that says, no. Paul, interestingly enough, actually being the Pharisee that's been trained by some of the top Pharisees of the day. So you can kind of get the impression that James being Jesus' brother, you would think that, he's just my brother, Why does he think he's this? I grew up with him. I saw him as a little kid, all this kind of stuff. And we don't get the impression that Jesus did a lot of miracles prior to his ministry. And that's probably why there's a lot of silence there, because he didn't do anything. So he may have been just like any normal kid, playing in the fields or whatever kids do, and working in his dad's carpenter shop or something like that,
Not according to the verse that talks about his being in the temple.
Right. Now,
12 years of age.
yeah. But that's not a miracle. He just went in there and
Not a miracle.
right.
Not that he was an ordinary kid.
Right. Yeah, not an ordinary kid, right. But yeah, we can get the impression that, but here's the thing. His parents were like, this is weird for him to do this because he normally doesn't run off. He normally, does all. So you also get this kind of feeling that as a kid, he's probably like a kid, doing kid things. There's a couple of, again, later Gospels that come out, and you may hear about this. I mean, these things are hundreds of years after the fact. And some of them come from the Middle Ages, stories about Jesus being a kid. And the people in the Middle Ages would like to tell stories about stuff about Jesus, and then they would say, we got this from this other source, and then the other source doesn't exist. And then it says, like, Jesus, there's this thing where this bird gets hurt or something, and Jesus heals the bird, or Jesus got mad at some kid and killed him or something like that. It shows Jesus not being like Jesus. But again, way later than the fact. There's no historical in the time period evidence of any of this kind of stuff. They just kind of took this blank spot in his life and just kind of jumped on that and kind of said things. Now, here's some of the stories that you'll hear. That he went with his uncle to England, who was a trader. And so he went on the boats with his uncle to go and do trading. Other people will say that he went to India to learn from the Swamis or whatever, and then came back, and then that's kind of where his ideas come from. So they take this big empty space in his life, and they just shove everything into it, all speculation, no real evidence for it, to kind of try and say, well, this accounts for why Jesus is so different than the Pharisees of the day, because he learned something while he was on his trip to England, or he learned something when he was in India. Again, there's really no evidence of this. And if anyone ever brings that up, say, okay, what evidence do you have that happened? You don't have any. Let's just take that off the table then, because then we call that speculation. Yes?
Have you heard of the movie, I guess it's just a movie, The Fourth Magi, I think it's called?
I heard The Fourth Wise Man. Wasn't that like a
Fourth Wise Man.
comedy or something like that?
3 are in the Bible, but the fourth that didn't make the rendezvous to
Right.
go see baby Jesus spent his life doing something entirely different. It's a great movie because his whole life is spent doing what Jesus commanded his followers to do,
Hmm.
which is go visit him in the jail, take care of the sick, and the poor, and so on and so forth. This Magi who couldn't make that run would spend his life doing that. And at the end of his life, Jesus comes to him, tells him, "Here's what you've done, what I have commanded you."
Oh, wow. I'd have to see that one. I don't. There's a couple of them.
It's all speculation.
Yeah.
Still, it's, telling us how we're.
Yeah, and so, but we all know that that one is a made-up story, right?
Oh, yeah.
But here's the thing, like in the Middle Ages, someone would make up a story, and everybody back then would know it was made up, but then today, we read that story, and then we're like, oh, maybe that's what happened. Maybe they had some other information. So 400 years from now, they're going to see that movie, and they say, oh, maybe that's what happened. You know, you have to think of things in this historical context and the way people look at stuff. Anyways, so you get a lot of things that are known to be myth or fairy tale, and even if it's done for a good reason, like to exemplify what Jesus Christ really meant, in his ministry and stuff like that, they take that, and now all of a sudden someone thinks, oh, this is true. Like the Da Vinci Code or something like that. It's just a story, and the guy's not saying that it's true. He's just taking all these other people's far-flung ideas and said, okay, let's take all these far-flung ideas, let's put it together, and then let's throw a conspiracy on it, like the church is trying to stop this from happening, and it sells novels, right? So he's not claiming it's true. He's just taking what everybody else, all those weird people that what they believe. He says, I'm going to take all this, put it all together, and I'm going to make it a mystery, and it's going to excite everybody. And that's exactly what he did. So the problem is you end up with then people that think, oh, this is like scientific research or something like that. It's not scientific.
Told it was not real.
Well, of course.
In the book, it states that. But then it goes on and makes me think of War of the Worlds type idea, where it sounds like it could be true.
Sounds plausible.
It sounds like that's actually happening or could happen. Gee, we're going to take that next leap and say it did. Prove it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's like they take the inverse and try and make you prove what they're stating didn't happen,
right,
rather than them proving that it actually did happen.
Right. And what we're talking about in here, we're pointing out evidence to what this is. We're not talking about, well, I heard the Illuminati did this. Based on, well, this castle over here, you see this little symbol up there? Well, that's an Illuminati symbol. Okay, how does that prove your point? Well, the way the castle's laid out. Okay. And it's all. I watch these shows mostly to sometimes laugh at what they say, but also because I'm trying to figure out, why do people believe these things? Because they give almost no evidence half the time when they say this, and they do things like this. Well, the castle looked like this and the layout like that. And you put all these pieces together, then it's this, and it sounds kind of plausible with that, except for, oh, by the way, that symbol, they had that in all the castles, or it's once you know more about each one of the little particular items they're talking about, then you're like, oh, well, that's not really as strong as you made it out to be. And that's kind of unfortunate. So James' brother Jesus, we have a lot of New Testament evidence for him. But we also have, outside of the New Testament, we have information from Josephus in the Antiquities of the Jews, specifically mentions him. And then we have two of the early church fathers also mentioning him. So we have early church fathers confirming what the Gospels are saying, and then we have our resident Jewish turncoat who sold out to the Romans, who is not a Christian, enemy guy, who is also confirming that James was one of the leaders of the church in there. So we have this information. Now, we go back to the Gospels, we can talk about James was against Jesus during his life, and we can find that in Mark and in John. So James was opposed to Jesus during his earthly ministry. That he appeared specifically to him, and that's recorded in 1 Corinthians 15, that creedal statement that we have. Because it's interesting, the Gospels really don't talk about that. The Gospels talk about James being against him, and then all of a sudden James is with the apostles. When we missed that part, right? They didn't put that in there. Interestingly enough, it seems like if the Gospels were written at an early date, they may not have caught putting James in to the story, right? If they were written at a later date, why wouldn't they have included James in the gospel accounts, right? Because James is now one of their leaders. We're writing gospels about it, but we just leave him out. It seems like we should probably put him in there, unless it was really early when we wrote the gospels. That doesn't prove the gospels were written early. It just is a, that's interesting. Why did it happen that way? James believes and becomes a leader of the church. Acts and Galatians feel that. And then Josephus, Eusebius, Hagiophysus, and Clement of Rome all say that he was martyred for his beliefs. So Josephus being the turncoat Jewish guy who's working for the Romans, not a Christian, and then we have the early church fathers. So the fact that he died for what he believed is not something that is only church tradition. It is also included with a Roman historian, who is not a thing. So, empty tomb. It's not one of the minimal facts that we've been talking about, but this one becomes kind of like a one that we've sort of already talked about, so I'm going to go through it briefly. Not every scholar believes it. However, about 75% of them, this is the +1 fact that we sort of already talked about. Not all the scholars believe it, but most of them, like 75%, will believe that there was an empty tomb. It's an interesting point. How would the Christian church get going if there wasn't an empty tomb? Wouldn't everybody just go back and say, well, his bodies are right over there? Or, it's in that pile of bodies over there, right? They could always go back and just point to wherever the body would have been left. And then they could point back to it. So starting as early as 50 days after the crucifixion, the apostles and disciples are out there fearlessly confronting the Pharisees about what they did. Now, they just killed your leader, so what's the first thing you should do?
Run and hide, which they did.
And then you probably stay hidden, right? No, let's go out and confront them. Let's go out there and make a bigger point. Let's tell them how wrong they are. You know, all the things that are going to get us to be their best friends, right? So at that point in time, only 50 days after, at any point in time, the body's going to be available somewhere, right? 50 days after, it's not going to be completely decomposed or gone or anything like that. So they could have been able to point at it. The Jews or the Romans could say, oh, no, this is where it is. The Romans very easily could have said, this is what we did with the body. We threw it in a pile. You know, they could have said something like that. And that would have dissuaded other people from coming up and believing this. Because the Romans could have just said this. Now, the Jews, based upon, you know, later testimony of Jewish scholars, the Jews were going around saying that the disciples stole the body out of the grave. Now, this might be why in the Gospels they make a big point of talking about there being Roman guards there and they put a seal on it. Well, that kind of a fact, do you really want to put that kind of a fact in the story? You may have left it out unless somebody was saying from a very early on that you stole the body. Right? Then you would want to make sure that they knew that they had that happen. So, now,
Isn't that an instruction from
Pilate. Well, I think it was the Jews said, the Pharisee leaders asked, and see,
right off the bat.
right, and this is another interesting thing, because to say that Jesus got thrown into this thing, why were the Jews asking Pilate to put guards on the tomb because Jesus said that he would rise again from the dead? This gives us two things. One, this kind of is coming from the Gospels again, but it validates her point that Jesus predicted it ahead of time, right? And that they were concerned about it, and so they wanted to put guards there. That means the Jews and the Romans knew where the body was. And they put guards on where that was. So now you have, when Jesus is risen and it is an empty grave, what's the only thing they can say? And what's the only thing that we have written that they said? That it was stolen. This is a really interesting fact. Put all this together here. So if Jesus was buried, then the Romans and the Jews could have said his body's over there. This means it was buried, right? And now that it's empty, the only thing they have left to say is it was stolen. That's the only thing they have left to say. Because they knew where it was. It's obvious they knew where it was. And this gives us a reason why in history or anything else, the only story that they have maintained, the Jews, is that the body was stolen by the disciples. So this means they knew where it was. Otherwise, they would just say, oh no, he was thrown in this pile of bones or whatever it was and left to rot.
So that's a good argument. Why didn't they produce the body knowing where
Right.
it was at, if in fact the body was still
Right.
in condition?
Exactly.
And the other thing is the resurrection had to be a bodily resurrection, did it not?
Right. So they knew what the resurrection was about, and they knew the Pharisees believed in a bodily. The Sadducees didn't believe in that, but the Pharisees did believe in a bodily resurrection. So, and they're primarily the ones that are running this after. You don't hear about the Sadducees much after Jesus' ministry. You really don't hear a lot of them during it. They pop up here and there because they were like a smaller group. The Pharisees were the predominant group out there. So we have the Jewish authorities. Again, we've already looked at that earlier, that they're the ones that said that they stole the body because they knew where it was. Matthew 28, 12 and 13 points that direction. Justin Martyr and Tertullian, both of those are also sources that we can look to for this.
I'm confused. Josephus, was he talking?
No, Josephus wasn't talking about the body in the tomb. Josephus didn't talk about that.
What did he come up with? I mean, he was there at the time.
He just doesn't write about it. He talks about Jesus briefly, about what they thought of him, but he doesn't get into. What the heck? Sorry. That was. Anyways. Yeah, it does. That's not even my ringtone, so it's really weird.
Didn't Josephus actually come about after the destruction of the temple?
He was around at the time.
The time
So,
of Jesus?
No, he was. I think he was born after Jesus had died and rose again, and then he was part of the Jewish rebellion, and then he, then he turned and joined the Romans, and then he started writing histories for the Romans. So that was well after the fact. So he wasn't a witness of the time. He was just a historian that was asking other people about it. And so he talks briefly about Jesus in James. He talks about the Roman practices at that time, but his story is primarily all the political intrigue that's going on. So a lot about what we know about the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Romans at the time, a lot of that comes from Josephus. If you read through his works, you're going to have an understanding of. You have to understand he's writing to Romans, for Romans. If you understand that's his bias when you're reading it, then you'll get a lot of information about Palestine in the first century and what's all going on and all that stuff. But he doesn't really talk about Jesus being buried or that there was an empty tomb. So, but he does mention him, does mention James, does mention the normal crucifixion parts. So we have him for that much information. So Justin Martyr and Tertullian, both early church fathers, give this as information. Another thing that we have is this: women are listed as the primary witnesses. And so you may have heard this before, or maybe even on the video. Generally, women's testimony was considered lower than that of men. And so if a woman testified in court, it took two women to equal the testimony of one man, right? In some instances. Some instances, they just weren't allowed to do that. So why would, if you're making up a story, why would you say that women are the ones that discovered the empty tomb? The first people.
Unless it was true.
Unless it was true. In other words, that's like mud all over your face. So women witnesses. And here's an example. Josephus talks about it. It says, don't let them They're not let testimony because women are admitted on account of the levity and the boldness of their sex. What I don't know what it means, but he's saying don't trust him. And then in the Talmud it says is not valid for that. And this is the one where it says same evidence of a woman. So both of these are pointing to the direction that women's testimony is considered less than men. So if any skeptic says, well, we have evidence, the Talmud and Josephus both say that women's testimony is considered less.
So the robber and the woman are put on the same level.
Pretty close. So, and if you look at some of the Roman writings, the Romans had the similar feelings, Greeks as well. So how did the disciples react to the women's testimony? That's interesting too. So how did they do it? Remember, they're Jewish men, so how did they react to it? And he looked at and he said, and these words appeared as insanity in their eyes, and they did not believe them. Right? So they're not going to. And then what was it in Luke 24? And these words appeared in their sight as wild talk of those delirium or an hysteria. So I picked these two translations because these both translations kind of try and take the Greek words and give you a bigger feeling of what the Greek is really saying here. They thought they were freaking nuts crazy, and they didn't believe it at all, is what it's saying. So,
Send some men to confirm it.
yeah, exactly. So summary of the empty tomb. Thus, an empty tomb appears to be historically credible in the light of the principle of embarrassment. In other words, remember we said if it's an embarrassing fact, it's probably more likely to be true. Because why include embarrassing facts? In fact, most of the embarrassing fact, if you were alive and Caesar Augustus is Caesar, and you're writing histories, you're going to prop him up, and you're going to make him sound like the greatest guy in the world. The other Caesars that went before, you're going to talk about their mistakes and all that kind of stuff. You're not going to talk about any of his. Later on, when another historian comes along and he's writing for Nero or something like that, he's going to talk about all the previous Caesars and all their shortcomings, but never his, right? Because they don't include those embarrassing facts. So the only way that we can really get embarrassing facts on Caesars is not from the person that was paying them to write the histories. It's always the later ones that look back and they dig up these stories, right? So we see that all the time. So the evidence is in favor of the empty tomb, and we have a majority of the scholars agreeing with it. So what do we call that? He calls it the jet factor, the empty tomb. Jerusalem, the fact that it's in Jerusalem, everybody's there, and they can easily go and find the body and say, there it is. We have enemies attesting to it, and we have the testimony of women, which is something that we would consider, or they would have considered at the time, less credible. And it would be something embarrassing for us to say it. They would have, if it wasn't true, I mean, if it was true, they had all the reason in the world to just say that Peter and James are the ones that found it, or Peter was the one that ran to the tomb, found it, and the woman had nothing to do with it. They would have just skipped over that fact. The fact that they included him is kind of an interesting thing just in itself. It really happened, and they still included it. That's like a double whammy, right? Because even if it really happened, they may still not have included it. So in conclusion to all this stuff, we have the minimal facts approach. So again, we just want to take these minimal facts, these 4 plus 1 that we have, consider only the evidence that's strongestly attested historically, because we're talking to somebody who's skeptical. So the 4 facts meet that strong criteria. The last one, we really don't need an empty tomb, because they really saw him alive after the fact. They touched him and all this kind of stuff. They were willing to die for him. But we have this fact, and it's strongly attested, but not as strongly as everything else, right? So we'll just throw that in one there for good measure. So we have our 4 facts. He died by crucifixion. Don't think he really lived through it. His disciples appeared. He appeared to them, and they believed that he appeared to them. Persecutors and people that were not followers of him while he was alive, he appeared to, and they believed, one of them being a persecutor. And then we have the empty tomb as an extra add-on that we add to it. So the question is, what is the best explanation for all those historical facts that we just looked at? That it happened, right? So that Jesus of Nazareth was resurrected. So opposing theories, which we'll get to next week and till the class ends, which I'm not 100% sure when that is, but it's a couple weeks, I think. So we'll talk about opposing theories. We'll talk about hallucination. We'll talk about all the different theories that are out there that we have, and then we'll show why each one of those is weak and doesn't meet the criteria that we already have established for historicity here. So, and their quote for this is, any opposing theory to Jesus' resurrection, however, is going to have to account for all of these facts. So it needs to account, so whatever they say, hallucinations or whatever, it has to account for all of these facts. How does it account for all of those facts? So we just made our 5 little points. Now, we'll look at the other evidence. Does it all account for it? All right?
So, what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? Now you said that maybe you could find some little snippet there about his crucifixion?
No, I don't think there's anything in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Anything that's in the Old Testament, except for the book of...
Or what Jesus said.
Yeah, that's not going to be in the Dead Sea Scrolls, because this is all prior to him being... But prophecy of anything that came forward. Now, the book of Daniel does... and it's a roundabout way to figure it out, but if you read The Coming Prince, he figures out to the day when Jesus would, on Palm Sunday, present himself as king. And that's exactly what Daniel's talking about in that passage, and the timetable that he gives, if you do the calculations and you calculate how many days there are, and you use a 360-day calendar, which is what I guess the Old Testament would use for a prophecy, it actually adds up to exactly the number of days to put it in that week. The other thing is, though, the book of Daniel written prior to Rome, written prior to the Greeks. Yet, that book, in the book of Daniel, talks about the Greeks, talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, prior to him happening, talks about the Romans taking, over after the Greek. So all of this history that he predicts going forward all pre-existed that. But the earliest copy is during the time of the Greeks. So it didn't really have the Romans in it yet, but he does sort of talk about that in a metaphorical kind of way. But then also have the prophecy about Jesus. So you have a couple of different things. And then there's also a bunch of other little things sprinkled throughout there in the book of Daniel that are all written prior to. So much so that scholars prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls would try to say Daniel was written after Jesus because it's way too close for us. In fact, they say Isaiah 53 is another one of those ones. It's way too close to what happened in actual Jesus. It must have been written after the fact. Well, ta-da, we now have older copies than Jesus of those two books. In fact, the great Isaiah scroll, you can look online and see it, has Isaiah 53. It's written prior to Jesus. And they have it displayed in in a big, huge museum. What is it? Dedicated to the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Great Isaiah Scrolls, out there for everybody to see. So you can see that prior to Jesus, Isaiah 53, and if you read Isaiah 53, it's just talking about the crucifixion of Jesus. So much so that Jewish scholars prior to this would say, "Oh, that was added by the Christians at some point in time." So it's really interesting. So you have all that kind of stuff. So yes, you have prophecy, and it's good to use prophecy when you can verify that the prophecy happened before the event happened. If I wrote down on a piece of paper that I prophesied that I was going to go on this road trip that I went on last week, but I wrote it afterwards and I gave it to you and say, I prophesied it last week, before that, you'd be like, I don't know. You know what I mean? Anyways. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for this time together, and thank you for this class and each and every one of us. Help us to continue to learn, and when skeptics ask, help us to be able to give them an answer, and let your Holy Spirit, touch them and bring them into your fold. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.